Hey everyone, welcome to the channel for another Escape from Tarkov video, finishing off my series on the top 3 low recoil builds for each main type of assault rifle in the 0.12 patch, this time featuring the HK416A5. The HK416, generally just called the HK or 416 in EFT, is essentially a hyper-modernized take on the AR-15 that uses precision German engineering to create an extremely accurate and versatile rifle. To make a long story short though, in Escape from Tarkov, it's basically a newer M4 with a higher fire rate. In a lot of ways, the 416 and M4 are very similar in game, with the HK having a slightly faster time to kill, though I honestly prefer the more extensive customization of the M4. When it comes to modding and the raw overall stats, you can actually make an M4 with significantly better stats than an HK, but it will cost you much more money and also requires you to swap out every single part. I was actually surprised at how few parts you need to swap on an HK to reach good recoil numbers, and I was even more surprised at the price of some of these builds. I always looked at the HK as a very expensive endgame weapon, but there's a plentiful supply of them on the flea market for a good price, and you only need to swap out a few parts to get the recoil to very manageable levels. These two facts combine to make building a 416 a much more affordable process. It's definitely not as cheap as an AK build, but all three of these builds are cheaper than their respective M4 counterparts. So with that all out of the way, let's take a look at the builds. I'll be looking at unsuppressed versions for the first two builds, but I'll mention what your best choice is for a suppressor as well, for all of us who love running quiet. First up for this video, we'll be taking a look at my budget 416 recoil build, which is surprisingly easy to set up. To start off, you can usually pick up an HK on the flea market for around 50 to 60,000 rubles. The first thing I did on this build was swap the default 14.5 inch barrel for the 16.5 inch version, available at mechanic level 3. The barrel itself seems expensive at around 34,000 rubles, but you can sell the old one to Skier for 18,000, meaning it only costs you 16,000 rubles total. This also gives you a huge jump from 3% to 10% recoil reduction, so it's definitely worth it. Next, I had the PWS CQB compensator, sold by Skier and Peacekeeper level 3 for $100 or 10,000 rubles. This isn't quite best in slot, but it's very close and significantly cheaper, so for a budget setup, this is what I generally take. If you want to run suppressed, the best option for recoil is the Daniel Defense Wave muzzle brake and suppressor, sold by Mechanic level 3 for about 63,000 rubles. This combo is quite expensive, but it also has the actual best in slot recoil stats for these numbers, so if you're going to be running suppressed, it improves the build even further. I left the default 416 quad rail handguard on this build because it has 4 rails already and there isn't really a good budget replacement. As my foregrip, I added the Zenit RK0 grip on this build, sold by Skier level 3, which gives a good mix of ergo and recoil control at a very nice price. A Magpul RVG grip would also work here as well if you want a bit more ergonomics. Next, I went with the MFT BUS stock from Peacekeeper level 3 because it has best in slot recoil numbers at a good price, making it an easy choice for any budget build. For the pistol grip, you can leave the default one on if you want, but I added the Hera Arms HG15 pistol grip for some extra ergonomics. It's sold by Mechanic level 4 at a very good price, and it's usually cheap on the market as well. Finally, I just want to mention this Cobra reflex sight that's on the build right now. I recently learned that it reduces your recoil by 1%, which makes it kind of a cool addition to any budget weapon build since it gives you both a cheap reflex sight and a small recoil reduction. It does have some less than stellar reticles though, and reduces your ergonomics by 6 points, so it has its disadvantages. Generally, I'll go for something like a PK06, but I wanted to show this one on the budget build. For the overall stats on this build, the recoil came out to 53 points, or 55 with a different sight, and the ergonomics is around 59 points. With the Wave suppressor, this build has 48 recoil and 55 ergonomics, though your price is going to be significantly higher. In total, this build unsuppressed runs around 100,000 rubles, or about 150,000 with the suppressor. It's not as cheap as a budget AK, but it's actually a nice bit lower than my budget M4A1 build, which kind of surprised me. All things considered, I was actually kind of surprised by how easily this build came together, and it works quite well. I played a ton of raids with this build in particular, and it really didn't feel like a budget setup. Next up, we have a mid-tier HK build that gets surprisingly close to best in slot stats for surprisingly little extra money. Again, I got a 416 on the market for around 50 to 60,000 rubles, and I'm gonna swap the barrel on this one as well. This time, I got the full length 20-inch barrel from mechanic level 4, which goes for around 39,000 rubles. Just like last time though, sell the old one to Skier, and it only runs about 20,000 rubles total for about 9% extra recoil reduction. For the compensator on this build, I went with the Bulletech ST6012 flash hider, which is slightly better than the PWS from the last build, and looks much nicer in my opinion. Like I mentioned earlier, the Daniel Defense Wave muzzle brake and suppressor is the best option if you want to run suppressed, so check that one out if you prefer. Next up, I swapped the default handguard for the extended 416 quad rail handguard at mechanic level 3. This gives a bit of extra recoil control and still has 4 rails. I upgraded the foregrip to the Zenit RK1 grip sold by Skier level 3 for about 17,000 rubles. This, combined with the handguard and longer barrel, adds a ton of extra recoil control to the build. For the stock, you can stick with the MFT BUS from the last build to save money, but I went with the HK1 stock from Peacekeeper level 4 on this one to get some extra ergonomics and counteract the longer barrel. Finally, I again went with the Hera Arms HG15 pistol grip on this build for some more ergo, but you can stick with the default grip if you want to save a little bit of cash. For the optic, I'm going to add 16,000 rubles to this build for the price of a PK06, but if you want to use a more expensive optic, that will up the price of your build. For the overall stats on this one, I got the recoil down to 45 points with the flash hider and 41 points with the suppressor. The ergonomics were about 65 with the flash hider and 58 with the suppressor. For the total cost, my math on this one came out to 135,000 rubles unsuppressed and about 180,000 with the suppressor. If you ask me, I think those are some very good stats for a rifle that only costs about 130,000 rubles to set up. None of the individual parts are super expensive, and I was really surprised at how much bang you get for your buck with this build. Before I move on to the final build though, I just wanted to mention that if you wanted a nice big ergonomics boost on this one, you can add the Hera Arms CQR foregrip, giving you the same recoil and a lot more ergonomics. Finally, we come to the best in slot HK416 build, which has gained quite the reputation in Escape from Tarkov as the end-all be-all PvP weapon for quite some time. It's not the undisputed king anymore, but it's still an insanely precise and deadly setup. Like the last build, I got the HK on the market for about 50 to 60,000 rubles, and then swapped the barrel for the 20-inch 416 barrel, which costs about 21,000 rubles total. For the muzzle on this one, I'm just straight up going for the Wave muzzle brake and suppressor for those best in slot numbers, and the obvious advantage of having a suppressor. For the handguard on this one, the HK MRS 14-inch handguard is the best in slot attachment for recoil, and you can find this attachment at mechanic level 3 for about 14,000 rubles. You'll also need to add a 6-inch key mod rail, which can be found at Peacekeeper level 2 for about 20 bucks. I'm going with the Hera Arms CQR foregrip on this one because it's all around the best grip on anything that it can be used on, regardless of what you might think of its appearance. Next, I'm sticking with the HK1 stock from the last build for the best in slot recoil numbers and a nice little ergonomics boost as well. For the pistol grip, I'm showing the HK PSG1 grip on this build, which gives insane ergonomics numbers at a pretty steep price of 25,000 rubles. This piece is kind of overkill though, so you can save from 15 to 20,000 rubles just by going with a different pistol grip. I'll also be adding the price of a PK06 onto this build as the optic. For the finishing touches on this one, I added a pair of MBUS backup iron sights and a Raptor charging handle. Both of these parts just add some ergonomics, so it's up to you whether you want to skip this or not. For the overall stats on this setup, I got the recoil down to 37 points and the ergonomics to 78 points. This is a pretty amazing set of stats. Not quite as crazy as a full build M4, but very nice and less expensive and complicated to set up. Speaking of that, the total price of this setup right here is around 224,000 rubles, but there's a few ways to shave down that price tag in a major way that I'll show you right now. First, swap the absurdly expensive pistol grip for the HG15 grip to save about 21,000 rubles in one easy click. Next, swap the Hera Arms grip for the RK1 foregrip, saving about 5,000 or so rubles and only losing some ergonomics. Next, if you want, you could even swap the suppressor for the Bulletech ST6012 flash hider and save up to another 50,000 rubles. This setup here comes out to 42 recoil and 69 ergonomics for about 152,000 rubles total. While it might be tempting to just always go for the best in slot parts, keep in mind that you can always go cheaper on the parts that don't affect recoil. Well, that about covers it for these 3 HK416 builds. I hope you enjoyed the video and now have a pretty good feel for how you can set up some low recoil HK builds of your own. I still love how much you can drastically alter an M4 in terms of appearance, but honestly, after making these builds and using them, I've become a true believer in the cult of the HK because it's much quicker and easier to set up, and in a lot of ways, it's more cost effective than an M4 as well. I'll be streaming more Escape From Tarkov on Twitch at twitch.tv/jdogthewise, and it'd be great to have you drop by the stream, so I'll leave a link for that down in the description. Thanks for checking out the video. As always, feel free to leave any comments, corrections, or suggestions down below, and until next time, stay safe in Tarkov City.